Welcome to the Born Free podcast, where we'll discuss the challenges facing the world's wildlife and ecosystems. My name's Sarah Locke, and I'll be talking to the passionate people doing their bit to try and secure a future where wildlife and humans can peacefully coexist. So welcome to the podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. Liz Greengrass. And Liz, you're responsible for Born Free's conservation projects overseas, all of our work in Ethiopia, Kenya, all over. But I know that before you were Born Free, so you started in 2014, but before you were here, you've actually had quite a lot of field experience yourself. So do you want to start a little bit with that?
Yeah, I mean, I started as a young conservationist in about 1996 when I got a job working with Jane Goodall at Gombe Stream Research Centre at Gombe National Park in western Tanzania, studying chimpanzees and their behaviour and ecology. And I spent 7 years there. And then after that, I did a PhD. And then I continued as a field biologist in conservation, working for various NGOs across mainly West Africa, West and Central Africa, and also even working for the private sector as well. So conducting assessments of biodiversity for mining companies, oil pump companies, oil and gas companies as well. So over the course of 20 years before I joined Born Free, I have a good experience of the impacts of industry on biodiversity and also working for both the NGO and private sector.
That's amazing. That's the most diverse career ever. I mean, so what was it like working in some of these really remote places then?
Well, it's always a privilege. You have to be passionate to do it. So you have to like wild open spaces to work there. But yes, I mean, that's where my passion is. And obviously to protect those places as well.
So while you were in Gombe, you didn't have no electricity, no running water, no Wi-Fi. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, back in the day, this was all before internet. So the only way of getting news from home, for example, was going to the post office once a month and picking up your airmail, which took 3 weeks to get to you.
That's incredible. How old were you then?
Early 20s, yeah. So, and there was no running water. So Gombe National Park is on the shore of Lake Tanganyika. So Lake Tanganyika was our bath and how we used to transport ourselves down to the local town by boat as well. No electricity, although we did actually begin to use solar more and more.
That's crazy. And were you completely by yourself, or did you have field assistants?
No, so I worked at Gombe Stream Research Centre. So it was a research centre made up of some expatriate researchers, but predominantly Tanzanian researchers. And we lived all together in a sort of village by the shore of Lake Tanganyika. Yeah.
And what was it like being a woman? I feel like you were so young. You just... did you ever feel any difference? I know that, I'm asking, I guess, because I'm obviously a student doing wildlife conservation, like a master's, and I know that the majority of my my year group is made up of women. I mean, out of 70 students, honestly, there is just the smallest proportion of men. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's amazing that you just went when you were, early 20s.
No, I've never felt in any way treated differently as a woman. I think always as an expatriate in Africa, you're well taken care of. So wherever you are, whether it was at Gombe or other places where I've worked, if you're working with local researchers, even local hunters, because you're an outsider, the local community will place your welfare in the hands of that person you're going out with. So it's their responsibility to take care of you. So I've always found in Africa that people have taken good care of you because the chief expects that from his community.
That's amazing.
So, yeah.
So what was your research based on when you were out there in Gombe with chimpanzees?
So I initially began working there, collecting data on mother and infants, and it was part of a long-term study. So I did that. And then increasingly, because Gombe is such a small national park, it's only 50 square kilometres, I couldn't ignore the fact that there were certain threats occurring. And so after a couple of years, I went down to the southern area of the park to survey an unhabituated community of chimpanzees. And the evidence had built up, their numbers had declined. And so I went down there and lived there for 2 years to determine what the reason for that decline was.
What was the reason?
In the end, we never, from my observations, we could never sort of pinpoint it to one thing. There were some poaching activity, but not directed at chimps. And eventually, some research that was being done revealed that those chimps had suffered from SIV, which is...
Okay, is that the strain? Is that similar to HIV? Have I made that up?
Yes. No, it's the... no, I'm trying to think.
Oh God,
it's a virus related to HIV.
Okay.
And what scientists believe is that SIV jumped at some stage into humans and became HIV. At that time, so this is at the end of the 90s, scientists knew that SIV was present in certain populations of primates, but they thought it wasn't detrimental to them. So it had evolved for such a long period of time with that species that it was no longer causing mortality. But actually, since then, they've come to realize that SIV does cause mortality in primates, and it was probably the most predominant factor in their decline. Yeah.
Oh, I see. I guess that's quite a common theme for conservation projects in general, is like not being able to explicitly say that it's this one thing, you know, and if you remove that one thing, you know, there are so many confounding factors, I guess, is really what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. I mean, there were also human pressure was building up in that section of the park, and there was one male chimpanzee that used to go out of the park and harvest palm nuts in the local village. And these villages, these fishing villages on the coast, were predominantly made up of Congolese people who do eat chimpanzees.
Yeah, I was going to ask if bushmeat.
Yeah. So in Tanzania, people don't eat primates. It's predominantly a Muslim area anyway. And we know for a fact that individual was eventually speared and killed because he was coming into the village. So there was conflict between some of these individual chimps who were moving out to feed in local villages.
Well, you must have some amazing stories from all that time that you spent there. What was the name? There was a chimpanzee that you mentioned earlier in our little chat before, and I was asking you about interesting stories that you have. What was his name?
Well, when I started, there was our alpha male was called Freud, and he was a lovely looking chimp, and he ruled through diplomacy. But he had a younger brother called Frodo, who was much bigger than him. He was the biggest chimp ever known at Gombe, actually.
Really?
He was very, very bullish, and he ruled through fear. So at that time when I started, he was beta male, if you like. And the only way that Freud could keep being the alpha male was whenever Frodo joined the group, he would display at Frodo and sort of isolate him away from the group. And when I first started, obviously, you're not quite as adept at reading situations.
Sure.
And there was one more. Was it in the morning? We heard Frodo calling, so we knew that he was coming to join the group. And he joined the group, and suddenly I found myself in between Freud and Frodo. So Freud was sitting upslope from me, and behind me sat Frodo. And when they start displaying, they sit on their haunches and start moving side to side, and all their hair pilo erect, so it all stands up to make them look twice their normal size. And Freud started to do this and started swaying from side to side, and I was just thinking about whether I should jump to my left or jump to my right to get out of his way, because I knew he was going to display right at me to get to his brother. And he displayed anyway, and before I knew it, he'd picked me up in his very, very gently picked me up off the ground. My feet were off the ground.
Oh my gosh.
And he'd got me in this bear hug.
What?
And then he very gently laid me on the ground and jumped over at me and then displayed at his brother.
That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
You must have been, what were you like in that moment? I mean, you must have been absolutely frozen.
All I could think was how soft he was.
Really?
Yeah.
That's really lovely. Sorry, that sounds really pathetic, but that really is amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So after that, Freud, he liked to play jokes on me. So just to give you one more example, that there was one time I viewed Freud leading a group of males across a valley, and they're heading in my general direction, so they're just moving like this, and Freud saw me and sort of had this kind of twinkle in his eye, and so I just moved myself. He was still maybe 50 meters away, so I just moved myself out of the way so that they could, have a free pass, because of course it's really important you keep your distance from chimps because of the risk of disease transfer, etc. And when I moved out of the way, he adjusted his direction to move straight at me. And I kept doing this. So as he got close, I kept moving out of his way. And he kept adjusting the direction of travel with 4 males behind him. And it was really funny. When he came up to me, he knocked me with his shoulder, but kept on moving. He didn't break stride or anything. It just kept on going.
Oh my God, that is amazing and terrifying at the same time. That's incredible. So would you say that you've always been quite species driven? Like when you first went out there, were you wanted to study chimpanzees? Is that what you were driven by? Yeah,
at that time I was very interested in chimps just because they're very rich in behaviour, and just interesting in so many ways. They're our closest relative, but as much as there are similarities in our behaviour and our societies, there are also a lot of differences as well. I always like to think of chimps as like humans without a conscience. They would never feel guilt, for example. Yeah. And they also defend territories like humans, and they patrol their territories. And if they find stranger chimps from a neighbouring territory, then they will kill them.
They are quite vicious.
So they can be extremely aggressive in much the same way that human societies can be as well. So they're very interesting animals to study. At the same time, I was very much, whilst I was studying their behaviour, very much interested in their conservation. But after I left Gombe, I was often working in places, conducting surveys of chimpanzees in places where hunting pressure had meant that numbers had declined a lot. And the thing is, as you're surveying an area for chimpanzees, the extra effort to survey for all other large mammals is very small. So you end up surveying for other species as well.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So my interest in species conservation grew from that, really.
Oh, that's lovely. So I guess your career has been, or was at the very beginning based on field research and field work. But how do you find, especially now in your role now, how do you find that we can best take that research and I guess transform that into tangible benefits for wildlife?
when you spend 7 years of your life studying a habituated group of chimpanzees, so you're following them from dawn to dusk for 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, you get very intimate knowledge of their ecology and behaviour.
I guess as well, really, a question that kind of leads on from that, but I mean, do funding opportunities when you're writing grants, and I guess maybe not when you're writing grants per se, but if you're approaching people or groups of people for funding, do they respond better to like species-based research, like behavioural-based research maybe? Or do you not find that's the case? There's not a massive difference between that and landscape-based conservation?
I don't know if I can answer that. I think Born Free is we are species centric, and I think a lot of other NGOs have moved away from that. So Conservation International developed the idea of hotspots and conserving areas which they identified as having very high biodiversity, but under the greatest threat, because their argument was that there's only limited funds for conservation, so it's best used in places with the richest, highest biodiversity, but which is under the greatest threat. So that was a way of allocating funds most efficiently, as just an example. But I think species conservation is important. So I think if we protect umbrella flagship species, then it's not only those species that we're protecting, we're also protecting a whole portfolio of species that are also dependent on the same habitat. So we use something that, like the lion, as a flagship species. It's one which people get behind. They want to see lions survive in perpetuity. But in supporting their conservation, we're also protecting all the herbivores, the prey species, under which which also rely on the same habitat as the lion, and which lions rely on for food.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so since you've made that transition from, I mean, how have you found that transition from your field work to now a more of a desk-based job? How have you found that since you started working at Born Free? I guess your challenges are so different.
Yes, I think so. When you're managing a project in the field, you're there on a day-to-day basis on the ground, so you can understand the challenges of implementing the project. It's there, and you understand that you have the context there in front of you to understand and to make decisions on how to move forward. At Born Free, in my position as head of conservation, I have project managers in the field doing that for me. And so the important thing is communication, having a good communication between me and the project managers on the ground to understand the status of the project at any point in time. And I think it's sometimes it can be frustrating if communication isn't as strong as it could be, to understand where the project is and how to take it forward. But generally, I mean, Born Free has very good project managers. You don't want to overmanage them. They're quite competent at managing the project in the field. But sometimes sitting back here, sometimes I feel a sense of frustration that I'm not there in the field, sort of understanding it on a day-to-day basis.
Like when you get a report back or you know, a detail, an issue comes up, I guess there must be a part of you that just wants to go out there now. Do you know what I mean? Like head out to Ethiopia and try and fix that yourself.
Yeah. But sometimes it's also good because you're not there. You can look at it from afar and more objectively than somebody who's living and breathing it. And you can then discuss with them various options. It is really good that, you know, with 20 years of experience, when challenges do come up, I fully understand how my project managers are feeling. And so I think that helps a lot, having experienced very similar things myself, that you can work with the project managers and you're sympathetic to how they're feeling. You understand what's going on, and then you can really work together as a team. So I think it enhances the team to have that background as the person that oversees it all.
I was going to say, you must have, you have a real honest understanding of what that feels like to be working and also living alongside from like a coexistence perspective when you're trying to mitigate human wildlife conflict. You have a really honest understanding of what that feels like to be working for a really long time out in a really rural community, sometimes for, as you say, like years on end essentially. And you know what those problems and what the challenges are that those people are facing, and I think that is really important. No, definitely. Okay, so how do you find then that we as an international NGO, but us based here in the UK, how do you find what is the best way to empower local people and to engage? I guess that is a really important step. What is the best way to do that, or a few key features, I guess?
So Born Free, we run projects which are inside protected areas, and then we run projects outside of protected areas. And those projects that run outside protected areas, such as a predator-proof boma work that we do outside of Amassed National Park in the greater landscape. The key thing is that if you're working in areas where there are local communities, you have to get local community buy-in, and you have to be honest and fair with local communities and empower them to make decisions. You can never, you can always lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you need to have be very honest with local communities and ensure that they voluntarily agree to implement the project with you. They're a key stakeholder.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to explain a little bit about the predator-proof bomas, actually? Because I was hearing about them from your team the other day, and it's a really interesting project. So it's based around at the base of Kilimanjaro in the Amassed ecosystem, and Born Free. I feel like I'm doing a spit. I feel like I'm about to get something wrong. By all means.
So we work in about 6 group ranches around Amassed National Park. Amassed National Park is a tiny national park. It's about 300 square kilometres, something like that. And the thing with Amassed is that Amassed is basically a swamp, the national park. It's fed by the waters from Lake Kilimanjaro. And so there's a lot of water around there. And during the dry season, all the animals collect in the national park and remain there because it's very dry outside the national park. But during the wet season, they all disperse out into the greater ecosystem. So really, to protect the wildlife, it's not just a case of protecting Amassed National Park. You also have to protect the animals when they leave the park, which is half the year, and also take into consideration the local communities. So one of the leading threats to lions is and was human wildlife conflict. So as they dispersed out into the greater ecosystem, they were killing livestock because the greater ecosystem is inhabited by the Maasai, who keep livestock. They're pastoralists. And as a result of that, the Maasai were killing lions in revenge, retaliatory killings, we call them. And it was a leading cause of mortality in the lion population. And they estimated that about 10 years ago, there was only in the magnitude of about 50 lions in the Amassed ecosystem. Since that time, Born Free has been building predator-proof bomas, which is about fortifying the bomas. And bomas are the way that the local Maasai corral livestock at night. So traditionally they use acacia thorn bushes. They pack all their livestock in and surround it with acacia thorn bushes. But while this corralled livestock at night, it didn't sort of prevent lions or other predators like hyenas attacking livestock. So what we've been doing is building predator-proof bomas, which are sort of permanent bomas. They can't be moved, and they're composed of chain link fencing and poles, and then outside on the inside we place that acacia thorn bush, and also build a gate in the side of it so people can enter and leave. And this has been very effective at stopping lions and other predators from entering. So it's reduced the level of conflict. We have other partners in also working in that landscape, including the Big Life Foundation, Lion Guardians. Mm-hmm. They're all working to reduce conflict. Some of them pay compensation to Maasai, and that also alleviates the anger among Maasai, because Maasai, their livestock is everything. Culturally, it's everything to them. So they feel violated if a lion or predator kills one of their livestock. And so compensation is another way in which you can reduce the risk of revenge killings. And there are other interventions that our partners have been implementing. So as a result of all the efforts of Born Free and also its partners in the landscape, it's now thought that the lion population has increased probably in the magnitude of about 200 lions, which means that the lion population has probably reached its carrying capacity in that environment.
That's amazing. And I guess that's so nice to be able to have such a positive and I guess obvious benefit to wildlife. And that must be something in our sector specific, being an NGO and, when we have our campaigns and you're asking for money from people and donations, that's really important, I guess, to be able to, really accurately prove that we've done a benefit.
Yeah,
it's about God that we've had a benefit.
It's about achieving our goals, and our expected outcomes. So it's definitely a success story. Yeah.
No, that's really great. So thank you so much, Liz. But I guess to wrap up, I do just want to know, what is it that excites you about wildlife conservation, and where do you hope the future? Do you feel excited about the future? Or do you feel nervous, worried about the future of wildlife conservation and species?
I mean, maybe excited isn't the word I would choose to use. I think that we're increasingly challenged by the fact that the threats to biodiversity are mounting because human population is increasing. And as human pressure increases, the cost of doing conservation to save species also increases. So we're increasingly needing to find new ways of financing conservation, whether it's through conservation banking, payment for ecosystem services, or even conservation bonds. So the financing conservation is an increasing challenge. So we have to find new ways of financing it, and also most importantly, in areas where the richest biodiversity exists, is generating future generations of humans that will value biodiversity and wildlife, because in many areas where I've worked, human societies don't value it or its intrinsic value. So.
Yeah, and I guess they both open up really interesting areas, of cross-collaboration. Obviously we want to get the younger generation involved in wildlife conservation, but also the funding, as you just touched upon there. I think that creates there must be a whole suite of really interesting collaborations and opportunities that people haven't really thought about before, or only really coming to the forefront now. Okay, so for yourself then, what does the future look like? Are you off to Ghana at the end of this year? Am I right in thinking that? Or was it Kenya?
So I'm off to Kenya in October to visit our 2 projects there, which is the predator-proof boma project around Amassed National Park, and also our lion monitoring project in Meru Conservation Area. After that, I'm due to be in Ghana. That's correct. We this year we funded a survey by 2 Ghanaian biologists to estimate the size of the chimpanzee and forest elephant population in a protected area in Ghana. And I hope to visit them late in the year after they've completed that survey to on a scoping trip to see what else the Born Free can do to protect those populations there. Yes.
Well, that sounds really interesting. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to hearing all about the new initiatives and the new work that Born Free will be launching, and yourself, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Born Free podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch the episodes, follow us on social media, or head to our website, bornfree.org.uk. My name's Sarah Locke, and our producer is Philip Fortuna. See you next time.